There are things you know without being able to say how you know them. I've lived long enough to understand that. 63 years will teach you to trust the weight in your chest even when every logical thought in your head tells you you're overreacting. I spent 4 months telling myself I was overreacting. I was wrong, and that mistake cost someone I love more than I will ever be able to put into words. My son married his wife 11 years ago. I remember the wedding. I remember thinking she was beautiful and sharp, and that she laughed a little too loudly at her own jokes. I didn't think anything of it back then. You don't look for warning signs at a wedding. You eat the chicken and you dance with your daughter-in-law and you tell your son he did good. That's what you do. They had 2 children together. My grandson, who was 9 at the time all of this happened, and my granddaughter, who had just turned 7. I won't use their real names here. I'll call them by the nicknames I gave them when they were born. I called my grandson Bud because from the moment he came into the world he looked exactly like my son did as a baby, and it made me feel like I was getting a second chance at something. My granddaughter I called Rosie because her cheeks were red and round and she smiled so easily that the first time she smiled at me I had to leave the hospital room to compose myself in the hallway. My son worked long hours. He traveled for work, sometimes 2 weeks out of every month. I never liked it, but I understood it. He was providing. He believed in his wife. He believed she was home with the children, keeping things steady, keeping things warm. He was wrong about that in ways that still make me sick to think about. The first time I noticed something was at Thanksgiving 2 years before everything came apart. Rosie sat at the table and didn't eat. She wasn't throwing a fit. She wasn't asking for something else. She just sat with her hands in her lap and looked at her plate like she was waiting for permission. I passed her the rolls and she looked at my daughter-in-law before she took one. One roll. She held it in both hands and ate it so carefully, like it might be taken away. I told myself she was just being polite. I told myself some kids are like that at the table. The second time was at Christmas. My grandson pulled me aside in the garage while the adults were having coffee, and he said to me, very quietly, "Grandpa, is Rosie coming to live with you?" I asked him why he would ask something like that. He said, "She cried last night. She was scared to come here." I asked him why she would be scared to come to my house. He looked at the door, back into the kitchen, and said, "I don't know." But the way he said it told me he did know. I brought it up with my son that night after everyone had gone to bed. He told me his wife had mentioned Rosie was going through a phase, being dramatic, testing limits. He said his wife was handling it and that I should trust the process. I didn't push harder than that, and I will carry that for the rest of my life. The visits became less frequent after that Christmas. My daughter-in-law started having reasons. The kids had activities. There was a school project. My grandson had a birthday party to attend. Always something. Always a reason that sounded perfectly reasonable if you only heard it once. When you heard it every single time over 4 months, it stopped sounding reasonable and started sounding like a wall. I called my son in February and told him I hadn't seen his children in 6 weeks. He sounded tired. He said his wife had mentioned that I was being a little too critical of her parenting, that some of my comments at Christmas had upset her. I asked him what comments. He couldn't tell me specifically. I asked him to please let me see my grandchildren. He said, "Of course. Of course." He'd set something up. Nothing was set up. I tried calling the house directly in March. My daughter-in-law answered on the second ring, which surprised me. She was warm. She was pleasant. She told me that the children were doing wonderfully and that we absolutely needed to get together soon, but that right now things were very hectic because she was remodeling the back bedroom and the house was a disaster. She said to give her until April, come Easter, and everything would be settled. She said she'd love for me to come for Easter Sunday. She said she'd cook. I said that sounded wonderful. I drove up on Good Friday. I want you to understand something about that decision. I didn't go early because I suspected the worst. I went early because the drive is 4 hours and I'm 63 years old and I don't love driving in holiday traffic. I also went because something had been sitting in the back of my throat since Christmas. Something I couldn't name or prove or explain to anyone. and I thought if I showed up and saw the house was fine and the children were fine, maybe that thing in my throat would finally go away. My son was not home. He was traveling, as usual. I knew that when I drove up. I parked down the street because I didn't want to ring the doorbell and get a speech about why it wasn't a good time. I sat in my car for a few minutes. The house looked ordinary. There was a bird feeder in the front yard that hadn't been there before. The curtains in the front window were drawn. I walked to the side of the house. I'm not entirely sure why. There was a path along the fence that led to the backyard, and I followed it without quite deciding to. The backyard was empty. The swing set my son had built 3 years ago was still there, but the swings were twisted around their own chains, the way swings get when nobody uses them for a long time. That's when I heard it. It was a sound so small and so wrong that I almost told myself it was the neighbor's cat. It was coming from below. The house has a basement with a small ground-level window along the back foundation, the kind of window that's more ventilation than view, with a plastic cover over it. I crouched down. I put my ear next to the cover. Someone was crying, very softly. The way a child cries when they've been crying so long they don't have anything left. Just that thin, exhausted sound that's almost more frightening than screaming. I took out my phone and I called my son. He answered on the 3rd ring. I told him to listen, and I held the phone up to the basement window. I don't know if he could hear it through the phone. I don't know what he heard. What he said was, "Dad, what is that?" And the way he said it, the way his voice shifted, told me that he heard enough. I told him to call me back in 2 minutes. I went to the back door and I knocked. Nothing. I knocked harder. I heard movement inside, upstairs, the sound of someone coming downstairs quickly. The door opened and my daughter-in-law stood there looking at me with an expression that went through 3 different versions of itself in about 1 second before it settled on something that was trying to be pleasant. She said, "Walter, what are you doing here? Easter Sunday?" I said, "I know. I was in the area. I thought I'd stop by and see the kids." She said the kids were at a play date. I said I heard something in the basement. She said it was probably the water heater. It had been making noises. I said I wanted to see the basement. The pleasant expression dropped. Something harder came up underneath it. She said, "I don't think that's necessary. The kids aren't here, Walter. I'll see you Sunday." She started to close the door, and I put my hand on it. I'm not proud of that. I'm not someone who pushes into people's homes uninvited, but I had heard that sound, and something had settled in my chest like a stone, and I said to her very quietly, "Open the basement, or I call the police right now." She stepped back. The basement door was in the kitchen. She stood near the counter while I walked to it. There was a slide bolt on the door, the kind you buy at a hardware store, the kind that's meant to keep something in more than keep something out. I slid it open. I opened the door. The smell hit me before the darkness did, that close, stale, particular smell of a space that hasn't had fresh air in a very long time. I found the light switch. I went down the stairs. The basement was half finished, the way a lot of basements are, with exposed pipes running along the low ceiling and old boxes stacked against the far wall. There was a cot in the corner. On the cot was my granddaughter. She was sitting with her knees pulled up to her chest, and she was looking at me, and the look on her face was not relief. It was fear. That broke something in me that I think is still broken. She was afraid of me. She was so used to whatever came through that door being something bad that she couldn't process the possibility of something good. I said, Rosie, it's Grandpa." She didn't move for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Grandpa?" I said, "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." She came off that cot and across that basement so fast I barely had time to open my arms. I held her and she was shaking, the whole small body of her just shaking continuously like she'd been cold for a very long time. I could feel her ribs. I sat down on the concrete floor with her in my lap and I held her there and I did not let go. Before I stood up, I took my phone out and I took photographs of everything. The cot. The slide bolt I'd photographed from upstairs. The corner where a 5-gallon bucket had been placed, which I understood immediately and which I will not describe in further detail, except to say that it was the moment I understood fully how long she had been down there. Along the baseboard near the cot, scratched into the drywall in a child's uneven writing, was a tally. Groups of 5. I counted them twice. 41 marks. I photographed the marks. I photographed the bucket. I photographed my granddaughter's arms. I photographed the bolt on the door. Then I carried her upstairs. My daughter-in-law was still in the kitchen. She had her phone in her hand. She said, "I'm calling your son." I said, "I already did." She said, "You had no right to come in here." I said, "Where is Bud?" She said Bud was at school. It was a Friday before a holiday weekend, and school had been out since noon. I knew this because my grandson had told me in a text message 2 weeks earlier that he had Friday off. I said this to her. She said she meant he was at a friend's house. I said I was taking Rosie and leaving, and that she should expect a call from the police. She stepped between me and the back door. She said if I took Rosie, she would tell everyone I'd broken into her home. She said no one would believe an old man over a mother. She said my son knew what kind of person I was, how I'd always meddled, how I'd always undermined her. She said all of this in a very controlled voice, while my granddaughter had her face pressed against my shoulder. I walked past her. I put Rosie in the passenger seat of my car. I buckled her seatbelt myself. I turned the heat up even though it wasn't cold, because she was still shaking. I got into the driver's seat and I called my son, who was already on a flight home. He'd booked the first available seat from the city he was in the moment I'd held the phone up to that basement window. Then I called 911. I told the dispatcher my name and my location. I told them I had found my 7-year-old granddaughter locked in a basement. I told them I had photographic evidence of the conditions. I told them I had the child with me in my vehicle and that the mother was still inside the house. I told them my grandson was unaccounted for and I needed someone to locate him immediately. 2 officers arrived in less than 8 minutes. I have thought about those 8 minutes many times since then. I sat in that car with Rosie in the passenger seat and I talked to her. I told her about my dog, who had recently taken an interest in stealing socks from the laundry basket. I told her I had bought a new fishing rod and I was going to teach her how to use it. I told her that everything was going to be different now. She didn't say much. She held my hand with both of hers and looked out the windshield. At one point she said, "Grandpa, I drew a picture for you." I said, "Where is it?" She said, "On the wall, under the cot." I didn't want her to find it. The officers spoke with me first, then went inside. My daughter-in-law was cooperative in the way that people are cooperative when they realize the situation has moved past the point where performance can help them. She let them in. She answered their questions. Bud was located at a neighbor's house 2 blocks away. The neighbor had no idea anything was wrong. She said he'd been coming over regularly for the past several weeks, that she'd assumed his mother knew, that he was such a polite, quiet boy. When the officer brought him to my car, he got in the back seat and looked at his sister and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I told her you'd come, Rosie. I told her." She turned around and looked at him. She said, "I know. My son landed that evening. I had taken the children to the hospital, where Rosie was examined. I will not detail everything in the medical report. What I will say is that the examining physician used the word chronic more than once, and that the case was referred to the county's Child Protective Unit within the hour, and that 2 detectives came to the hospital to take my photographs as evidence. My daughter-in-law was taken into custody that night. My son arrived at the hospital at 9:30 in the evening. I was in the waiting area when he came through the doors. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years on a 4-hour flight. He stopped when he saw me. He didn't say anything, neither did I. He sat down next to me and put his face in his hands, and I put my hand on his back and we sat there for a very long time. He asked me, eventually, how long. I told him about the tally marks. 41. I told him about the bucket. I told him about the bolt on the door. He was very still while I told him these things. The kind of stillness that's not calm but is the opposite of calm. The kind that comes before something breaks. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I should have known." I didn't say anything to that, because it was true and also because I had spent 4 months not pushing hard enough, and I was not in a position to tell my son what he should or shouldn't have known. What we eventually pieced together through the investigation and the trial was this. My daughter-in-law had been escalating her treatment of Rosie for over a year. She had told my son that Rosie had behavioral problems, that she needed firm discipline, that she was manipulative and attention-seeking. My son had believed her. The school had noticed some things, but the notes home had been intercepted. A teacher had asked Bud once if everything was okay at home, and Bud had said yes because he had been told what would happen to Rosie if he told anyone. He was 9 years old and he had been carrying that for 7 months. There's a particular kind of evil in giving a 9-year-old that choice. I think about it more than I should. I think about that boy going to school every day and coming home every day and making himself small and quiet and useful, doing everything right, trying to make the temperature in the house stay low, trying to protect his sister with the only tools he had, which were compliance and silence. I think about him going to the neighbor's house, not because he wanted to play, but because he needed somewhere to breathe that wasn't that house. And I think about him lying in bed at night in a room above a basement where his sister was, and the math he was doing in his head, the math that children should never have to do. The case went to trial 8 months later. My daughter-in-law did not plead guilty. She maintained throughout the entire proceeding that she was a good mother, that the discipline she used was within her rights as a parent, that I had fabricated or exaggerated the evidence, that the photographs I had taken were misleading. Her attorney argued that Rosie had emotional and behavioral difficulties that required unconventional approaches. He used the word unconventional 6 times in his opening statement. I counted. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They came back with guilty on all counts: child endangerment, child abuse, unlawful imprisonment. The judge sentenced her to 22 years. The prosecutor had asked for 25. I sat in that courtroom and I watched her face when the sentence was read, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was not satisfaction. It was just a very deep and tired grief. 22 years doesn't give Rosie back the 41 days. It doesn't give Bud back the 7 months he spent being a 9-year-old jailer. It doesn't give my son back the marriage he thought he had or the family he thought he was building. But I'll tell you what I've been told by people who know things about what happens inside prisons. People who've worked corrections for a long time, who've seen how the population in those places organizes itself around certain unspoken rules. There are things that people inside will tolerate, and then there are things they won't. A woman who locked her 7-year-old daughter in a basement for 41 days falls definitively into the second category. I've heard that she was moved to protective custody within her first month. I've heard that protective custody in that facility means 22 hours a day in a cell by herself. I hope she has a bucket in the corner. It has been 2 years now. Rosie is 9. She has a therapist she sees twice a week, and she is doing what the therapist calls remarkably well, which I understand to be the clinical way of saying she is a resilient child who has a lot of work still ahead of her. She sleeps with a nightlight. She doesn't like closed doors. When she comes to stay with me on weekends, she checks, every night before bed, that the doors in my house are not locked. She opens each one and closes it gently, and then she comes to find me and I tell her good night. Bud is 11 now. He's quiet in the way some kids are quiet when they've seen too much, the thoughtful quiet, the kind that will probably make him a good man if someone around him is paying attention. He's been in therapy too, and he talks more than he did. Last spring he told me, out of nowhere, while we were fishing off my dock, that he was sorry he hadn't told anyone sooner. I put my arm around that boy and I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. I told him that he had protected his sister the best way he knew how with what he had. I told him that what he did going to the neighbor's house, staying close, keeping himself safe enough to be there, that was the right thing. I told him that the adults around him had failed him, not the other way around. He didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly and looked out at the water. We caught 2 bass that afternoon. He wanted to release them, so we did. I think about the moment I stood in that backyard before I found the window. I think about all the ways that moment could have gone differently. If I had decided to wait until Sunday, if I had respected the boundary my daughter-in-law had set, if I had continued to tell myself I was overreacting, that I was an old man who was too involved, that I should trust the process the way my son had told me to trust the process. I think about the weight that had been sitting in my chest since Christmas. I think about how many times I had almost called it irrational. How many times I had almost talked myself out of it in the name of being reasonable, being polite, being the kind of father-in-law who doesn't make waves. I'm 63 years old. I've made my share of mistakes. I've been too slow and too quiet in places where I should have been fast and loud. I can't undo those things. But I can tell you that when your body knows something your mind can't prove yet, you should not spend 4 months being reasonable. You should not let someone manage you with politeness and inconvenience and the social pressure to stay in your lane. Your lane is wherever your family needs you to be. The picture Rosie drew for me, under the cot, on the baseboard where her mother wouldn't think to look, the police photographed it as part of the evidence, and after the trial they released a copy to me. It's a drawing in pencil, shaky and small, the way 7-year-olds draw. It shows 2 figures, one tall, one small. They're holding hands. Above the tall figure, she wrote one word, spelled the way a 7-year-old spells it. Grandpa. I have it framed. It hangs in my kitchen where I can see it every morning when I make coffee. Some mornings I stand there for a while and look at it. I don't always know what to say to it, or to whatever is on the other side of it. Whatever confluence of circumstance and stubbornness brought me to that backyard on a Friday afternoon in April instead of a Sunday morning in spring. But I show up early now for everything. Rosie asked me last month if she could help me plant tomatoes in the garden. We spent a whole Saturday afternoon on our knees in the dirt, pressing seeds down into the soil, her small hands working next to my old ones. She talked the entire time. She talked about her teacher and her best friend and a book she was reading and a song she liked and what she wanted to be when she grew up, which she said was either a veterinarian or a professional cookie taster, and she hadn't fully decided yet. I told her both seemed like excellent career paths. She laughed. That laugh? I've been hearing it in my memory since the first time she made that sound in a hospital room 11 years ago, and every time I hear it now, it means something different than it did before. It means she made it. It means we both did. It means that whatever is still hard, and there is still plenty that is hard, there is also this. A Saturday in the garden, dirt under our fingernails, seeds going into the ground. Something you put in the dark that still finds its way up.